I was living with my brother in a small, outdated two-bedroom house in a bad part of town. We were both saving up to move out, and thankfully we managed to a few months after this happened. At the time, I was working overnights at a hospital, and my brother worked mid-shifts at a grocery store. Because of our schedules, we rarely saw each other for more than a quick hello or goodbye. It was my day off, and since I worked overnights, I usually tried to keep my sleep schedule the same. So I woke up at 8 p.m., had breakfast, and greeted my brother as he came home from work. A couple of hours later, he went to bed, and I stayed in the living room, watching Netflix and relaxing. Not too long into the show, a light beamed into the room from outside the front window, almost as if someone was pulling into our driveway. I got up and went over, looking out and seeing a car parked behind mine. Their lights were still on, blocking any view of who was inside. I didn't have much time to look though, because a sudden knock came at the front door. Of course, I was immediately aware of how odd this was, but even more so because it was pouring outside. When I looked out the front door, a man was standing in the rain just outside the porch. I didn't know if this was the person from the car, and maybe he just got out really fast, or if there was someone else. But either way, I wasn't going to answer the door. I went back to the window and waited. A couple of minutes later, the man by the porch walked up to the car, got into the passenger seat, and then they backed out and drove away. I thought it was really weird but assumed they must have had the wrong house. I sat back down and started watching my show again. I didn't even really give it much thought after that, and spent what I think was the next hour lying on the couch. At some point, I dozed off. I wasn't asleep for long, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, because the TV was still on, and only one episode had played through of the show I was watching. I paused it and sat up, taking a sip of water and trying to shake off the sleepiness. After a moment, though, I realized the rain was really loud. I turned my body and looked at the front hallway. The front door was cracked open. Feeling a rush of panic, I ran over and looked at it. I knew that I'd locked it before, so the only explanation I could think of was that my brother had woken up and gone outside for some reason. Or at least that's what I was hoping it was. In the back of my head, I was thinking about the people who showed up earlier. I closed and locked the door, then called out for my brother. The house was quiet aside from the rain hitting the roof, and my brother didn't respond. I started walking up the staircase and looked down the hallway. The door to his room was open, which was really odd if he was still sleeping. As I got closer though, I could hear what sounded like multiple people moving around in his room. Just as I got up to the doorway, a man came running out, knocking me over and continuing down the hallway. Another man followed him, running around me and down the stairs. As I hurried to my feet, my brother came out of the room and said to call the police as he chased them down the stairs. I was dazed at everything happening so suddenly, but I did as he said. As I followed behind him, the two intruders ran to the side of our house and down the road, and my brother locked everything behind them. While we waited, he said they woke him up and held a knife to him to keep him from talking. He said this all happened only a minute or so before I woke up, but when they heard me coming upstairs, they got flustered and ended up just running. They never said why they were there or what they wanted. Whether it was a planned attack on us specifically isn't known, but to me it seems like they were targeting my brother in particular. But maybe they just didn't notice me on the couch. It's hard to say. I'm a groundskeeper at the cemetery in our town. Despite what people think, the job usually isn't that creepy. The only thing that unsettles me are a couple of old bells by some gravestones that have been there for almost 2 centuries. Most nights nothing happens, and I just go about my work. Sometimes kids show up, but they always run off when they see me. Our town is small, and this is the only cemetery for several miles, so it's pretty big to fit all the gravestones. It was a Thursday in the middle of summer. I showed up at 10 p.m. like usual, and went into the small brick building we called the outpost. It's a single room with some security screens, maintenance tools, and a small bathroom. I grabbed the keys and locked the main entrance gate. While I was there, I saw a man in a black hoodie walking on the other side of the gate along the fence. He walked past the gate and continued along the fence, so I went back to the outpost. I put the keys back and stayed inside for a half hour, looking over some things the day workers had left me. Around 11, I grabbed the key to the runner, a small ATV with a basket on the back for yard work. I pulled it out and started making my rounds, checking gravestones for damage and picking up flowers or other items left behind. I drove around collecting flowers when I saw a figure on the other side of the yard. I looked around for more people but saw just one guy. I started driving toward him, but he didn't look at me even with the loud ATV noise. He kept walking through the yard, staring ahead, thinking he might be in distress from a recent loss, but I pulled up next to him and tried to be polite. "I'm sorry, sir, but the yard is closed until tomorrow morning. I can give you a ride out." He kept walking, not looking at me. I pulled up beside him again and was firmer. "You have to leave now, or I'll have to call the cops for trespassing." He finally stopped and looked at me. His eyes were red and wide open, and he had a sad smile. It creeped me out. After a few seconds, he lunged at me, hitting the side of the runner. I sped off before he could grab me and headed straight for the outpost, calling 911 on my radio. I parked the ATV outside and went into the security room, continuing to inform the police. The department is only a couple of minutes away, so I holed up in the outpost and looked through the security cameras to find him. Before I could, loud banging shook the door behind me. He hit the door hard, shaking the floor and walls. I had nothing to defend myself with, so I just watched the door and hoped it wouldn't give in. I checked with the dispatcher, and they told me the officers were only a minute away. Then, the banging stopped, and I heard him sprint away. I looked at the screens to see where he ran, and when the officers arrived, I told them. They didn't follow him because he ran towards some trees, and it was too dangerous to chase him into the dark. I made an official report, but weeks went by and nothing was found. I don't know if he was in a fragile state of mind from a recent passing, but what happened that night likely won't ever have any answers. When I was 19, I worked as an Uber driver. I hadn't figured out what I wanted to do with my life yet, so I hadn't started college or anything. I was just driving for Uber to pay my bills until I could figure it all out. That night, I planned to drive from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. Most other drivers weren't working those hours, and I was a night person, so it suited me. Around 11, I picked up a lady from a bar and drove her 35 minutes to her home on the edge of the city. It was a quiet, secluded area. After dropping her off, I got another request from a location 10 minutes away. I hesitated to accept because it was further out, not back toward the city, but I hoped the next passenger would be heading to the city, where there would be more work. I drove to the pickup spot, which was through farmland and very empty. The final turn led me down a narrow dirt road between fields of tall grass or wheat. At the end, I saw a farmhouse on a small hill. I parked on the grass in front of the house. The lights were off, and nobody was outside. I honked lightly to let them know I was there. With my windows down, the sound of the crops blowing in the wind was loud. Then, a sudden tap on the passenger door startled me. I hadn't thought to look back at the road because I assumed the person would come from the house. A man leaned his head through the open window and stared at me. After a strange moment of silence, I asked if he had ordered the Uber. He looked around the back seat, then nodded and asked, "Can you help me carry something to the car?" Since I was working, I quickly answered, sure, thinking it was just some luggage. But I regretted it instantly. He walked toward the house, and I followed behind him. He rushed inside without looking back. When I got to the porch, the wide open door showed an empty hallway with no lights on, and the man was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't hear any footsteps. An eerie feeling came over me, so I called out. The house remained quiet. There was no way I was going inside, so I turned and ran back to my car, driving back through the field to the main road, and cancelled the Uber. My biggest regret that night was not saying anything to the police. Since nothing happened, I thought I had no good reason to. But every time I think about it, it seems less likely that it wasn't something bad. I looked up information on the farmhouse a month later and found it was last sold in the 1960s. The man almost definitely wasn't the owner and probably didn't even live there. What was waiting for me inside that house if I had followed him in is something I'll never know.